Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. My name's Sharina Sinosius and I work with the IMARC team, the International Mining and Resources Conference. We've been doing the IMARC METS Arena since June this year, and I think we were just calculating that we've done about 10 to 12 episodes that have run for the different parts of the mining supply chain. So everything from exploration through to digital transformation. And how fitting of us to be here at the last episode for 2020 on the topic of closure, planning and rehabilitation. So I'd like to welcome you all. The series has been sponsored and supported by the Victorian Government as well as Mining Plus, who have supported us throughout. Both of their roles have been in selecting the speakers as well as the topics, and also choosing the METS companies that we get featured. So it's great to have their support in deciding on who is going to be part of the episodes. The whole purpose of the episodes is really so that METS companies could showcase their capabilities and match those capabilities with a miner or otherwise an industry-specific problem statement or opportunity. It's great to have the speakers that we have on today. We've got Anna Littleboy from, I guess, CRC TiME or TiME. And then we've also got Colin McVie, who's representing Mining Plus as our technical advisor, who will ask a number of the questions to the METS companies. From the METS company side, we've got Kieren Moffat from Voconiq, Loch from Landloch, and we've got Anthony Walker, who is joining us today from Decipher, Christian Larsen from Terra, and there we have Owen Cavanough from RTL Mining and Earth. Mining and Earth, or Earth and Mining?
Mining and Earth, maybe.
Mining and Earth Services there in Victoria. So we welcome you all on board to this episode. As I've said, you're all on mute at the moment, but if you have any questions, you can type it into the chat, or otherwise we will unmute you, so then you can actually ask the question to our speakers. You can ask any of these questions during or after their presentations, or otherwise at the Q&A at the end. This episode should take about an hour or otherwise a little bit less. And then, without further ado, I would like to pass on to our guest speaker for today, who is Anna Littleboy, who I believe doesn't need too much of an introduction. A lot of people do know who you are, Anna. And but we are definitely keen to hear about this particular issue or otherwise this opportunity in relation to closure and rehabilitation. Thanks, Anna.
Thanks, Shireen. Hello, everybody. Anna Littleboy is my name, and I'm currently the research director for a cooperative research centre for transformations in mining economies, or CRC TiME, as it is more easily known, I guess. CRC TiME is actually a $100 million investment over 10 years. And that money is coming from industry, all levels of government and community representatives into essentially a joint venture, a research centre, to try and understand how we can effectively close and relinquish mines so that we can deliver sustainable ecosystems and prosperous livelihoods post-closure. As part of setting up CRC TiME, we actually work with all our partners, but in particular with industry, to understand what the problem with mine closure is. Why are we failing at the moment to effectively transition at the end of the mine life? Around the world, there are actually very, very few examples of an effectively closed and relinquished mine. We have closed mines that are being very well managed but are still under the mining company lease. There are examples of agricultural productivity on old coal mines in southeast Queensland. You have, for example, the Century Mine, where MMG have leased the mine to New Century Zinc to sort of look for new products from the waste and spoils there. We also have seen around the world abandoned mines that have essentially been turned into really, really productive assets. I guess the Eden project in Cornwall is probably one of the poster childs for that, as it's now contributing an awful lot to the Cornish economy through as a tourism attraction. And Nick Curry, I see you're online. Of course, Kidston is another example where an abandoned mine is having a whole new lease of life as a renewable energy hub. But this issue of closing and relinquishing and handing back the mine in an orderly manner is something that we're not really managing to achieve. So why is this? What's the problem? If you ask that question of industry, they will talk about the really important technical challenges of, managing your water quality and your water systems so that you can deliver water systems that are relevant for post-mining water use. They'll talk about the importance of re-establishing vegetation into some form of sustainable ecosystem that can regenerate and exist on its own. And they will talk about the importance of recreating safe and stable landforms and landscapes to deliver post-closure land uses that can be vibrant moving forward. But as well as these technical challenges of how the industry closes the mine site, they'll talk about ambiguity. They'll talk in a very frustrated way about the level of ambiguity there is about what targets are they expected to meet as they close the mine. Confusion or lack of clarity around closure criteria that differ between different jurisdictions and are not always equitably applied. They'll talk about not always understanding the concerns that people have around residual risk, the consequences of the mine long after it's left town. What are these residual risks? Why are people concerned about them? What can be done about them? And how do you manage that? Do you manage it through compliance, or do you manage it by thinking about what an acceptable residual risk is? And they'll talk about the difficulty of understanding the expectations of people who will receive the land back into their ownership or their accountability. They talk about increasing social concerns around the health of the land that's coming back to them, different pressures and expectations about all these wonderful opportunities that could be delivered using the assets from our mine site, but aren't always able to be delivered because they're not necessarily consistent with the regulatory frameworks. So for the industry, they want to complete the mine life cycle and hand back the land, and they are willing to spend money on addressing the technical issues in order to do that. But as I've just outlined, what we don't always have is a clear view of what we want to do with land post-closure. For communities and their governments, the life goes on beyond mining. The region is the constant for them. Mining is just a temporary land use. And they're very concerned, obviously, with two issues. One, they want to understand how they can use the prior existence of a mine to create opportunities post-closure. And they want to ensure that the prior existence of a mine doesn't increase any risks or adversely impact on those opportunities. So we've actually got a classic wicked problem around mine closure. The stakeholder groups involved have very different concerns. They have different timeframes of concern. And it's most certainly not just a technical issue. Those with the long-term interest in the region and the use of the region post-closure do not have a high level of control in the decision-making that will deliver mine closure and the outcomes that result from it. So this is a long way of saying that within CRC TiME, the reason for the investment from both industry and government is because our current systems and processes, whether they're in industry, in communities, or in government, don't appear to be coming together in a way that delivers effective and acceptable solutions. Critical issues, such as what information is required to bring stakeholders together. How will this information and data be used? Who pays for it? What legislative constraints exist? And how do those affected by long-term risk have a say in short-term decision-making? We haven't quite managed to join up our systems so that those linked conversations that balance long-term risk with short-term decision-making between multiple stakeholders can be safely and constructively held.
We might, I'm wondering, Anna, whether or not we might stop you there and see whether or not any of the METS companies can bring any of these solutions up, if that's okay, Anna?
Sure.
Yeah.
And come back to you, yeah.
Something, Shireen, that Owen here from RTL, we've had the discussion a bit here, and I've had it when I work in Africa as well, that the people that get to make these decisions are not those who are accountable for the outcomes of those decisions. And you've only got to look at the images on the screen at the moment. There's a group of us that are one side of 50 and a group of us the other side of 50. And, you know, one lot of us are in positions, as Anna quite rightly said, of power and influence that make these decisions. But those that are left around to be accountable for the results of those decisions aren't generally in the tent enough to do that. So when I look at the young environmental engineers I deal with, they often express their frustration and not being able to be heard, but ultimately they're the ones that are going to see the outcome of whatever we do. Yeah. And I think that's one of the big struggles that we have, is having the experience listen to the youth that, you know, a couple of years' time, we'll be sitting back and we're not going to be accountable for the decisions we make today because we won't be around, but they will.
All right. What we might do, Owen, is come back to these sort of conversations. Kieren from Voconiq, you're first up with what Voconiq sort of offers and what sort of solutions you've got. Let's hear from you, Kieren.
Great, thanks, Shireen, and g'day everybody. Kieren Moffat. I lead Voconiq, which is a CSIRO spin-out company. And we effectively bring the voice of community inside the companies that work alongside them. If we go to the first slide, this is the problem that we were working on as a research team in CSIRO, where Anna Littleboy was my boss, in fact, and we spent about 10 years really trying to unpick and build the science around understanding the nature of this problem that's really captured by this quote, this statement, and really trying to articulate that empirically in data in a way that companies can understand and use to refine their engagement strategies, investment strategies, and their thinking. If we go to the next slide, however, and I've lifted this diagram straight out of the ICMM Integrated Mine Closure Good Practice Guide, because I think it really neatly encapsulates both the stages of the mining life cycle, but also kind of the problem here as it relates to a key area of risk for most companies and a key issue in this closure and rehab space, which is that stakeholder engagement and planning and implementing social transition are present. They're in the conversation, but they're really right down at the bottom there. And so if we could go to the next slide, I've just fixed that for them and reflected how I think this should work, which is that when we're thinking about life after the current operation, we really need to be thinking about that stakeholder engagement and those social transitions through those stages of the mining life cycle, exactly at the moment that we're starting to think about winding down every other part of this business and transitioning to a different kind of future. And this is particularly the case as we hit that critical moment that we hear about a lot with companies as the conversation about closure starts to really gain traction, and communities start looking around, not quite believing that this is going to happen, having had extensions to mine life most often for a long time, and trying to lead up to how do we actually help communities transition. So on the next slide there, we've got, I guess, how we tackle this in practice, which is to collect community sentiment data systematically and consistently across time, whether that's monthly or quarterly or 6 monthly, to get that constant drumbeat of community sentiment around the key things that our science tells us are both most important to community trust and acceptance in the company, which is of course then an enabling factor for a company to be working on those factors that determine the resilience of a community and their capacity to manage through those transitions and to adapt to change. And they are in kind of key kind of areas that we all expect, like economic vitality and strengthening institutions. But also, I think in new areas that companies should really be reflecting on, like how do we build the social networks and communications infrastructure within communities to solve their own problems, and how do we build their leadership capacity to determine how they want to deal with us as industry. I might leave it there and happy to answer any questions about how we do this kind of work.
Colin, did you have some questions for Kieren to kick off?
Yep, thanks, Shireen. Yeah, thanks for that, Kieren. I guess a couple of initial questions. Obviously, like you mentioned, the community trust and the dialogue around that as part of the social licence to operate is a key thing for mining projects across the globe. And it'd be interesting to understand, you know, how do you guys approach the topic of mine closure when that dialogue's occurring as part of the social licence to operate?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in a couple of ways. So I think that actually trust is a real enabling factor in those relationships. So yeah, sure, it helps you to manage the risk of rejection, so blockades or legal challenge, those sorts of things. But actually, it's also trust is also critical in creating the space to be working on those resiliency factors within community, which leads to a community that's able to be independent of the company post-closure. I mean, this is the real challenge here. Throughout the life of the mine, effectively what you're doing is building dependent relationships. Building trust in that relationship between the company and the community allows much earlier on in the piece both to be working with the community about the realities of life as closure comes closer, but also I think to be working on the internal conversation within companies, because a lot of those investments in those things that make communities independent of a company are also things that aren't very sexy for a local GM to be investing in. You can't put a badge or a sign on community networks and the strength and robustness of their ability to make decisions internally, which might in fact make them more difficult neighbours for a company, but in fact makes them more likely to transition effectively post-closure. So I think trust is fundamental in this conversation, and social performance really drives the capacity of a company to manage that post-closure life more effectively.
Okay, thanks, Kieren. That's great answer. Maybe just to expand your response there a bit more, like how do you create that internal voice for the community within the mining company, you know, and maybe particularly say in an operation, and does it differ for different locations, you know, be it a remote mine site or maybe a mine site that's closer to a community or a more populated area?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we're operating in 5 countries at the moment, and shortly we'll be in Africa and Europe. So what we see across those locations is what is important to community is pretty consistent, but varies by, you know, relative importance in terms of its able to drive trust and acceptance. So the issues may differ in terms of their importance. But in terms of collecting that data and bringing that voice into the company, yeah, absolutely varies by context. So in Latin America, pre-COVID, we would do a lot of face-to-face engagement in neighbourhoods, in communities, and collect that data, you know, in that way with teams on the ground. Whereas in Australia, we do a lot of that work online with particular approaches to ensure that, say, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders have a voice and data is collected in a way that's culturally appropriate, and similarly to bring the perspective of critical stakeholder groups like pastoralists in the Pilbara inside the company, them being such a small but really important group for companies like Rio Tinto and BHP. So yeah, but the methods vary by context, but what's super interesting is that the key attributes that lead to trust really don't change a lot. What does change is how much trust there is and how well companies are doing on those factors that lead to trust. And you can see that in the culture of the company. And often our conversations are much less about how do you kind of, how do you invest X dollars to achieve a better outcome than it is about, well, what is the culture of the company here and the team, and how can we help them to be engaging effectively with those perspectives from outside the fence, because often they're quite challenging, and that's a really important skill for modern company and modern community engagement practitioner to have.
We thank you for that, Kieren and Colin. We might now move on to our next METS speaker and come back to any questions after. Is Rob Loch from Landloch. Hi, Rob.
Hi. So I'm going to talk from a slightly different perspective, though I understand Kieren's work and perspective extremely well, being involved in community consultation for an inland rail project, which has, let's say, not won too many hearts or minds in this region. So Landloch is essentially a science-based technical company. We do a whole heap of soil science and land vegetation-based work, and I'll quickly mention that we are, in fact, the only entity in Australia that measures soil erodibility and models, predicts erosion rates for a whole range of landform options within the country. Others will model, but we are the only ones who base it on measured parameters. And we're widely involved in rehabilitation planning and design across a range of industries. So if we just have the next slide. We work right across mining, construction, agriculture, forestry, and widely around Australia and the world. We take measurement very seriously, as you might have started to realise, and we've got facilities in Australia and overseas. And we've got high-level equipment to study both runoff, erosion, sediment movements, and the like. Have the next slide, please. So we're distinctive for being able to deal with problems, to solve technical issues, and to come up with better ways to do things. All too often in our experience, we're basically trying to close a stable door for someone after they've let a horse bolt. A lot of the issues that we deal with in mine rehabilitation and closure can be traced back to poor decisions or a lack of decisions right at the very early beginning of the mine. I had one experience chatting with an enviro in Victoria, which was planning an expansion of a gold mine. They sent me samples of their materials, and I pointed out to them what the consequences would be for them if they were to go in open cut mine and have to build a waste dump. And she came back to me and said, well, thank you for that. We have looked at that and we were very close to deciding to mine underground instead, and you've made our mind up. I think they saved themselves a world of hurt. But the sorts of things that we do can be as simple as looking at topsoil guidelines for capping landfills or waste dams. And in one instance, I think I noted that the engineer who'd written the topsoil guideline had read the wrong column in the Australian Soil Standard. To a soil scientist, it jumped out, but obviously not to an engineer. That was worth about a $2.5 million saving to pick up that error. We do research for people. For Arrow Energy, we researched methods of stabilising soils to avoid some of the more traditional and ponderous ways of managing sediment movement from their drill pads, and they estimated that the change in methodology over their full project would save them about 50 million. Equally, we've looked at using erosion modelling to design landforms, including putting geomorphic elements into those to get more stability and less geomorphic risk. And sometimes you can change the landform, and sometimes with our modelling skills and with our measurements, we can show that in fact they need to change the material. I can think of a dredge spoil bund that had been put on bordering the ocean up in the Pilbara that was consistently eroding, and we were able to show that if it was going to be stable, the gradient would be so low that the toe of the slope would be 30 metres out to sea. That one was stabilised by mixing rock with the material, fertilising to get very good plant growth to bring the soil up to the normal properties of a soil in the region, and we were able to get a structure that was stable under a cyclone within 3 months of its construction and delivered some of the best rehab. So we can approach problems in many ways, but because we work off data, we're able on occasions to demonstrate to people the need for significant changes in plans right at the outset of a mining project. How are we going for time, Shireen?
We're going to have to stop you there, Rob, and ask that Colin ask you a question, and we've also got one from the audience.
Thanks, Rob. And I think, unfortunately, most of us could relate to your analogy about so often mine closure and that the horse is bolted. Interested, I have experienced the work you guys do for capping materials and different things, and I know a lot of your work, and like you said, is really grounded in science, as you put it. What sort of new technologies or approach have you found, around the work that you do and others around the whole mine closure area that's of interest? New approaches and technologies that maybe you've seen or think should be looked at.
If we talk in the last 20 years, the design of waste landforms has started to use erosion modelling, not only the traditional agricultural models, but moving into landform evolution models. And we've been able to get the landforms move away from old traditional bread loaves with a lot of engineered structures, most of which are designed to a return period of storm. So essentially they're designed to fail anyway, sooner or later. So we've moved the landform design to something that's much more geomorphically based. You don't need precise engineering to have it stable, and get to something that is much more functional. Our recent study in WA showed that landforms incorporating geomorphic elements, by and large, were much more stable than landforms built to the old traditional pattern, which is fun because up until a couple of years ago, regulators in WA have still been fighting hard against some of those geomorphic elements.
Okay, thanks, Rob. I guess one quick question that's come from the audience, probably related to more the science aspects you talked about. Are you doing any measurements of carbon sequestration that is a consequence of rehabilitation of the landscape? One in the chat.
Not specifically. We are involved in a lot of rehabilitation monitoring, which is a very good way for us to track the success or failure of a lot of stuff that we do. And so we do look very hard at carbon accumulation, taking the point of view that when you're rehabilitating a soil profile, if you're going to get back to something akin to an analogue site, you must accumulate the carbon and nutrient stores of an analogue soil, or else you've got an ecosystem there that's a bit like a company trying to run without capital. The first downturn in conditions and it's in trouble. But no, we haven't looked at it from that point of view. We've been very keen to do so, but at the time the regulators, which is in WA, were not prepared to let mining companies look at it or to consider carbon credits.
Okay.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Colin. We might move on to our next MET speaker and come back to some of the questions. I know we've got one submitted here from a gentleman from Chicago, but let's move on to Owen Cavanough from RTL Mining and Earthworks. Owen?
Thanks, Shireen. Just a brief run through about RTL as a business, and I think it's important to understand where we sit in the market and for how long. So RTL, let's move into the next slide, thanks, has been operating for 28 years, and it was established around a partnership, and it was a personal link between the then head of TIS, Ken Roach himself, and Lindsay Fox came together. The work down in the valley since that time has been around partnerships, and I think that's an important thing where we look at mine rehab going forward, and it's certainly something that I'm quite passionate about, and part of the reason why I was hired here to take the business forward. We are now 88% owned by TIS as the largest mine services company around, and Lynn Fox remain a shareholder there, and it's a very strong personal connection on that side. We have approximately 200 pieces of equipment here, quite a large fleet of bulldozers, and we pioneered the dozer mining method here with the coal. A decent fleet of excavators and our off-highway trucks, and as you can see, looking at that fleet of equipment, we're well positioned going forward in the mine rehab space. So moving on to our next one, cognizant of time. The contract models really is a key thing when you look at mine rehab going forward. So with Energy Australia as the current owner at Yallourn and all the previous owners, it is a long-term alliance, and it's a true alliance. We formulate the budgets together. We do all of the long-term planning together. The equipment planning sits in there. It is a full open book cost model. Everything sits there. Our clients are aware of, and we work as one. That model there carries us out to end of mine and beyond. So the contract sits at the moment for another 11 years. We work at Yallourn, but we are actively involved in rehab as we go. So the mine ownership plan is very structured on how we mine gives us our future going forward. So we don't do things twice. So it's do it once, do it right, and think about where that sits. Moving back, I think that's just bounced a bit there. That's it. In with AGL, we provide them at the Loyang mine with a cost plus contract. So they retain their IP on what they want to do and when they want to do it, and we provide them with a service around that. So that gives them their ownership and view on it commercially, and we just provide the service to them of equipment and people. But again, we do rehab for them, we do ash control work, and we do some mining work there. We also do traditional lump sum tendered earthworks, and a lot of that in this area around here has been around council landfills, not only managing existing ones, but rehabbing previous failed efforts. So that's a core area of competence that sits within the business that directly translates across into the mining side as well, with managing wastes. Going out into what we're looking to our future, that base of the alliance side is something that I'm personally keen to really lift the connection with Indigenous communities, A, from my personal background as a Wiradjuri person, but B, how that connectivity links into rehab, because ultimately it comes down to, in my view, who is the ultimate custodian of the mine once it's all finished, and their buy-in and ownership of that rehab, because there's not much point in doing rehab if the ultimate custodian doesn't like what they're given. So having that buy-in and linkage right through is something that's very important in my view to making it work and work well. And the business model that we have of equipment planning skills and expertise very much works hand in hand with local communities being involved with determining their final outcome and what they end up with accepting at the end as their future as a custodian. Moving, next slide there. The Mine Alliance there is really a great, strong image that sits. We do a lot of work in there that is custom. So that's 2 D11 dozers in the photo that's on the slide. The little one is what comes from CAT. The big one is how they end up when we've played with them for a little while. But we spend a lot of time and effort investing in dealing with what our clients require. And again, it's open book. they're part of that decision-making process. They're part of the future. And the continuous rehab and mine planning has really taken a new level up with the computing power and expertise that TIS have been able to bring the last couple of years to this, in that long-term huge data modelling that's required to do the umpteen movements of material over the mine site for the next 11 years and then beyond, to see where that sits. And that data management, certainly we couldn't have done that with computing power that existed 5 years ago, but where it sits now is a terrific opportunity for all of us, and not just what we do here, but across the industry. So you really need to make sure that what you do once. And it's always been my philosophy: do it once, do it right. And getting the thinking behind that is something that mine owners and custodians need to better understand, but also government, who are holding the mine bonds as such around the place, to ensure that that money is not wasted. Flowing to the next slide. Thanks.
Might need to be the last one, Owen.
Yep, that's all right. So Loch, the work that we do in there is very much based on what they need. And Loch is different in that their life of mine takes them out to 2048 at the moment. So their business planning model around that is very tightly held on a commercial basis. It's not something that, we will be privy to. But again, that's looking at where the different commercial models sit to provide clients with what they need going forward. So we service their requirements as it happens, but as a business, they have significant challenges there going forward. So you have to support them as best you can, because ultimately the cost model is a huge driver for what their actions are today. Thank you, Shireen.
Thanks, Owen. Colin?
Thanks, Shireen. Thanks, Owen. Maybe time for one quick question, Owen. I know you mentioned a lot of equipment, and I've been lucky enough over many years to see Yallourn a couple of times with your dozer push and different things, and you mentioned the mine planning. Within the work you guys do, and particularly on closure and managing mines, what do you think are some of the interesting upcoming technologies and practices in this space, and maybe what you're thinking of using?
The ability to use the 3D mapping as such, and moving into SATS equipment, so semi-autonomous equipment, is really providing the accuracy and requirements around this work. So from a safety perspective, a lot of old mines, there's works to be done in areas where you don't want to put people at risk. So, we have to get into zones where batter stability is an issue, for instance. And moving into that technological space with, utilising SATs and the smarts around it, taking the LiDAR information from a mine, putting it into what the geomorphology outcomes are, but then programming the equipment to do it without putting people at harm's way, is probably going to be one of the key focal points, because mines are generally mined within pretty tight boundaries of safety. It's probably the most polite way of doing it. You get every little bit of ore out that's viable, but no one's really keen to go back in there and do anything with it from a structural perspective. So being able to address that safely into the future is going to be one of our biggest challenges.
Cool. Thanks, Owen.
And I think, Owen, your point about doing things once was also reciprocated by Rob's comment here in the chat box as well, about the cost of rework can be very high. Thanks for that, Owen. We might move on to Christian Larsen from Glass Terra. Thanks, Christian.
Thank you. In fact, it's a nice little segue along from what Owen was talking about, doing things right once. We started life as a company mainly doing digital transformation projects around big spatial data. And what we found was that, it's a digital transformation is an area that's kind of littered with failure, really, in mining. But we found one of the big gaps was the ability to obtain real-time high-precision data, terrain data. And so basically 2 years ago, Glass Terra set out to acquire and develop a way of doing that and we ended up using LiDAR, similar to what Owen was talking about. Could you go to the next slide, please? And so what we've developed is a piece of kit. So in the middle right, that's what it looks like boxed up. That sends information to the cloud. Frontline leaders can use it on site, or remote operations can use it elsewhere. The main sort of use cases are in plan compliance, doing it right first time, as Owen talked about. It also has uses in inventory, not so much a theme of this particular discussion, but stockpile management. And also it's heavily being used in sort of unplanned movements, so safety, particularly around tailings dam. Next slide, please. The key, this is a fairly high, this is still in development technology. It is out there being used, but they're all the main features. But the top two are the important ones. The data is real time, so it's not like survey, which is intermittent, or it's got to be real time to do a lot of these very valuable use cases. And the one that we've been working mainly in 2020 is making it plug and play, so that on-site people can install and implement the technology themselves without having to have a bunch of technicians fly in. Very important during COVID times. Next slide, please. So where it gets used, so let's say in slope monitoring, there's lots of, I know Anthony's up next with using satellites, for example. Also, there's a lot of radar technology. These are very broad scale technology. The technology we use is quick to deploy, very small scale, generally used to monitor sort of awkward areas where you may only need to, it can be either permanent or very short term. So here's an example where we're monitoring a slope at an abandoned mine in this instance. This is Mount Morgan. Next slide, please. Where we're also now, this is our more recent deployment. This is a thing that we're deploying right now. This is a permanent installation. This is in Africa. And this is another one of those issues that are coming up around slope stability, and that's where the slope is vegetated. So there's lots of terrain around the place that, there may be downstream impacts if there's failure, but you have to monitor. Radar and satellite has problems with this area, but it turns out that LiDAR works very well when you're dealing with vegetated slopes. And majority of tailings facilities are not being utilized anymore, and therefore they tend to grow vegetation on them, and therefore they start having problems in terms of measuring and monitoring what's going on. Next, please. What we haven't dealt with yet, but we think there's fairly prospective, is in progressive rehabilitation. And this is probably our technology combined with a lot of other people's, but once you can start, a lot of the initial earthworks is kind of done at a macro scale. And this is, basically volume balancing the dirt. I'm a mining engineer by background, so these are tasks that I have actually done in the past. But what happens is when you get to the execution phase, it doesn't really work out. There have been a bunch of simulation type systems that have been developed over and been in use for the last decade or so that actually plans the material movement right down to the truckload by truckload. What it hasn't been matched with is, but then they find that very difficult to execute. And so what's been lacking is that real-time monitoring. Again, it's sort of what Owen was intimating at is kind of that's the next stage. So that's where we're at. That's what I think, that's where we're heading into the future. And that's it for me. Next slide is just my contact details. Thank you.
Thanks, Christian. I guess as a mining engineer as well, I could see definitely how your technology would help in executing some of these earth-moving scenarios. So thanks for sharing. A couple of questions I've got would be, you did mention, how your system can be used for tailing storage facilities, which I think is a key issue for the industry globally for obvious reasons after some significant failures the last couple of years. How does your product and its approach really help those sort of the monitoring of those facilities, say compared to say radar-based solutions or others like you mentioned? How does it? How do you think it differentiates?
Radar and INSAR satellites is very broad scale and most appropriate for that. And so, you know, our technology wouldn't be seen as a replacement for them. Where it comes into play is when you have, you know, like the vegetated slopes, the awkward, you know, there's always bits that are not covered by those, you know, shadowed out and things like that. So our technology could be more seen as an infill technology that fills out the gaps that are not covered by those systems.
Okay, just maybe to one last bit question, if I may. Is that easily connected, say, to a site's emergency warning system or things like that as well?
Yes, basically, Anthony can probably answer that because they've integrated with our systems. But typically, integration time for us is about 3 days for any legacy system.
Yeah, cool.
So we've made interoperable. You know, we don't deliver the full stack. We're a component product and we've designed ourselves to fit in with whatever system is necessary that we need to feed into.
Yeah, that's great, Christian. And I think you're right. Probably a perfect segue into Anthony's presentation.
Anthony, let's kick off with your presentation, then we'll go into a Q&A then.
Thank you, Shereen, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to talk to you today. So from a Decipher perspective, we're a corporate METS startup in the Wesfarmers Group, which in itself is pretty unusual. We're also a CRC TiME partner, so you know, and all the lead-in you were talking about is pretty important to us, and we chose as a business to focus on rehab, closure, and relinquishment due to poor track records and also opportunities for improvement in there, Anna, that you spoke about in your introduction. So for us, we're concerned about data and access to data by key stakeholders. I think, Owen, I wrote down during your session that you know, long time frames are involved with rehabilitation, and sometimes you're starting right in the beginning days of planning, and you're working through the life of mine, and then post it to closure and post-mining land use. So managing that data and managing the continuum of that data is the domain of what we're trying to do. From our customers, we've learned that approximately, and it depends on operation to operation, but about 8 to 12% of a rehab budget is spent on monitoring. So we feel as though we can play a good efficiency role in that particular process or in that particular area. And typically the data that we're looking at is what Rob, you were talking about from a Landloch perspective. That kind of data, how it's consumed, how it's looked at, and how it's managed, not only by the enviros in the business or the rehab managers in the business, but by anyone else that needs to consume it. So third-party consultants that are maybe coming to do studies, and maybe regulators that need access to that information, depending on how they've set up the rehab program. Owen, you mentioned LiDAR, and obviously, Christian, you mentioned LiDAR, you know, as an example. Picking up through API and getting that data into the solution is really important. And what we found is monitoring data is growing exponentially. There are so many diverse sources that it's coming from as technology evolves. And one thing that we've learned is it's becoming increasingly diverse. So how do we manage that, and how do we bring that together in a simple to use kind of environment that is able to be used by more and more people and analyzed by more and more applications? So that's really the problem that we're sitting in there, looking at these sometimes siloed and sometimes disparate or non-aligned systems and approaches, and looking at the effective management and the efficiency in that process. We all know that spatial data and time series data is difficult to manage on an ongoing basis. It's not easy. But using a system like Decipher is a way of unifying that and bringing it together. So next slide, please. So I've just put this together, a possible number of monitoring sources for a typical operation and a few reports on the right-hand side. This is by no means exhaustive. But Christian, you mentioned the macro satellite and macro INSAR kind of view of rehab, and then drilling down into the more detailed view, the micro view that gives you a more real-time feedback. And there's things from landform monitoring, groundwater, surface water, habitat stability, seedling trials, soil monitoring, and there's a whole swath of detail that goes into each of those. So it's about taking those monitoring sources and bringing them together in a single unified view. And obviously it's based on risk or issue for that operation or what the specific post-mining land use is. And obviously from our side, by the time that we're looking at that data, we're using the observational method to ensure that it's within design criteria, success or failure against that design criteria. So next slide for us, please. So into the last slide, on the top right-hand side, there's a picture in there of rehabilitation summary reporting. So this is the bones of what companies are trying to produce in terms of their rehab closure and relinquishment programs. So how many hectares are in various stages leading up to that relinquishment? What are the criteria that we need to meet to get it relinquished? And against those criteria, what are those monitoring point sources that will enable us to get that relinquishment and get it done as quickly as possible? And in many cases, with the correct science sitting behind it. So just click through some of those images on the bottom right-hand side. There's an API into the Glass Terra product. So pulling that in and using it within Decipher to get particular information up. Just click through to the next one, please. That's looking at satellite data, that's looking at biomass as a proxy to health of vegetation on an offset property in New South Wales. Just click through. And then just picking up other chemistry data for point data sources coming through, and just click through again. And here we're looking at maybe compliance requirements from an obligation perspective that need to be met in terms of conditions and the actions that need to go into to get those done so that those criteria are signed off and met. So basically, making this information accessible across devices, making it accessible internal and external audiences. So government, one of the sponsors of this source, being able to access information, look over the fence, which is something we learned from our agriculture business, and making sure that it's promoting integrated and near real-time monitoring of data as much as possible. One of the stories that struck me, and we've mentioned tailings facilities, which is an area we spend a lot of our time working in. The younger generations say when they step outside a building, they lift up their mobile phone and they say, "What's around me?" or "What can I find around me?" And that's kind of the level that we want to get. Appropriate information that so appropriate decisions can be made accessible as appropriately in and outside the organisation. So that's really what we're about in a nutshell, and what I wanted to bring to this discussion today. Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony. A quick question. Obviously, you talked a lot about integration of technologies, and obviously as well, what, for example, what you do with Christian and Glass Terra. How does your technology overall integrate with other softwares and systems? And I think related to what some of the other presenters talked about, the mine design and the scheduling software and those sort of things within a mining operation.
Thanks, Colin. Great question. So we also mentioned radar and a couple of those other technology. So if there's inclinometers or seismometers or any of those devices that are producing data at a point source, integrate into that and pull it into the solution in real time. So we really worry about the problem of how to get that data available in the browser and out to an end user. In terms of landform design, we have clients that want to track things like diesel usages against a cost code for a particular rehab area and project. And we can pick up that data from an Oracle ERP or a SAP system and bring those through and report those out in a dashboard type view. And that's really the input costs that are put together for a area of rehab that's of particular interest at that time. And then once that has been made available for rehabilitation, then it's about tracking the next stage, which is vegetation growth, seeding, and all the other processes that come off the top of that. So that's where you're integrating and harvesting data from another swath of providers that are generating that data, the soil scientists, those sorts of things that are producing that info. So it is a wide domain of info. And one of the things that we need to be very careful about is, as a MET supplier in Australia, there's a myriad of devices and there's a myriad of sources out there, and we can't be prescriptive about what customers are going to use and what they're going to be purchasing on site. So it's a process of how to get that information into together into a single container to make it available. Yep.
I agree. Thanks, Anthony. That was great.
No worries.
Thanks for that, Anthony. I think what's interesting here, and I'll come back to Anna perhaps to make comment here, is you've got some of these technologies and these METS companies who can obviously input data or collect data and then spit information out to be able to help with some of these solutions. But then you've got also the human aspect around the regulations and understanding the different jurisdictions, the communities, the Indigenous people, etc. Anna, what would be your closing comments around, the balancing of the technologies and also, I guess, the human element around all of this?
I think that's the kind of art and craft what we need to do here. I mean, one of the points that I'm always thinking about is that the importance of the data and the evidence cannot be underestimated, and that needs to come through in a number of different dimensions. And the more we can do to integrate those data sets together so that anyone looking in can get a really good view, not only of the technical aspects, but also some of the aspects of, if you like, the mood of the relationship between community and the mines, the better. I think the problem, though, is that we're dealing with uncertainty here. There is uncertainty around the long-term risk as a result of mining having happened, and that's where the human element begins to come in, because people have different reactions to that uncertainty. They have different priorities. They have different perspectives on how significant the uncertainty is. So one of the things that it's great, both Decipher and Landloch are members of CRC TiME, and the kind of information that they can bring to the table is the information that helps us really begin to understand what do we know and what don't we know, and how do we then have a human conversation about what we don't know. So that point that you make about how do you blend technology, data and information with the human element of decisions that can have very long-term consequences to different people is, for me, part of the nub of why mine closure is so difficult, because if we can't get people to have confidence that there is a future post-mining, it's going to be very difficult to give people the confidence to say to the mining company, thanks, you've done your job, and we'll take it from here.
Okay, thanks, Anna. Colin, I mean, a comment from you around the 5 METS companies. Any particular ones, stand out, or are they all, can be used collaboratively? Is it different uses per company? What are your thoughts, Colin?
I think it's been a great session, Serene, and I think the prime point, like what Anna just said, is we need all these bits of the puzzle to try to bring it together. And I know we're running out of time for more discussions, but I think it's a key thing where I think, like we've discussed previously, we have a key thing in Mining Plus about trying to promote the mining industry in a positive light. Mm. And I think it's an issue for all of us to get the people in the industry and get the support. And probably the most negative perception we have there is what we do around mine closure and the lack of it. And this is probably one of the most important things for us to change the perception of the mining industry with the communities we work in is around this issue. So it's been a great discussion.
Any of the METS companies have any final comments before we close off? I know that we've answered some of the questions in the chat box already, but any comments from anyone? Kieren, Christian, Owen, Rob, Anthony?
All right. Yeah, I'll jump in. With regard to, I suppose this is maybe something that Anna could comment on, but I believe that there's a bit of an elephant in the room in this whole mine relinquishment closure space. And that is, if you go to the ultimate decision maker, which will be the Minister for Mining, So let's just say you're the Minister for Mining in Queensland. You come into the job and you've got to make a political decision to now take a mine, a closed mine, off the books of the miner and onto your books, right? That's essentially what's happening. And when he comes into the job, he starts the job here in Queensland, at least, with 110 abandoned mines that have just been left behind, and they're just sitting there. And then you're simply going to that minister and say, well, why don't we just make it 111? And I think the elephant in the room is the amount of abandoned mines that already in inventory is at toxic levels. And why would they ever sign off on accepting another abandoned mine while there's this big stock of pre-existing abandoned mines? I believe that's the elephant in the room. That's what drives political decision making. That's also drives perception of the mining industry because of what, you know, the sins of the past, if you like. And unless the sins of the past are owned up to and dealt with in some way or form, you know, I think we're in a bind. Us technical people can work our guts out. We can get things more precise, more beautiful, more defined. But while that, what I think is a toxic inventory of abandoned mines sits there, I just don't know that you can overcome the political impasse. Over to you. I don't know. Thoughts, Anna?
Well, it's certainly a very good point. I think the legacy of abandoned mines around the world absolutely colours the whole issue of how do you actually close mines that responsible operators are looking for a way to close and get the mine off their books. So I don't have any easy answers to that, because the question then becomes, you could do things with the abandoned mines, but you've got to pay for it.
Exactly.
And the question is, who gets to pay for it? Which is one of those really, really thorny issues. And as you know, in Queensland, you know, there's hope that the sort of, you know, the financial changes that have been made may begin to make some inroad, particularly in some of the worst abandoned mines in Queensland. I think there's another point, though, in your question about why on earth would a Minister of Mines ever sign off on closure of a mine? So let's assume that the mine had a clear target and had done all the amazing technical work that people can already do to, you know, close out a mine and everything. There is quite a compelling reason, I think, as to why the Minister of Mines should be incentivized to sign off, and that is because of the increasing association of investor confidence in past track record of social performance in mining. And I don't think we're very far off. In fact, I think we've already started to begin to see investment in part to be affected by whether or not a mining company or a jurisdiction has a history of being able to close mines. So if your Minister for Mining wants to encourage future investment, then that's an incentivization to be able to show that mines who come to a jurisdiction can be closed. But there's a lot of steps to go before we're in that situation, and you're absolutely right. The abandoned mine legacy is a huge legacy to address. In CRC TiME, we've had lots of conversations about to what extent will we work with abandoned mines, and we're very keen to use them as sites to try new technology on. And we've got all the state governments are a partner in CRC TiME, and they're all very keen for some of our METS companies to be taking their solutions to the abandoned mines that they currently have on their books. Great question, Christian.
Okay.
And just a little thing to add to that, though, one of the challenges we do face is sovereign risk. So I've worked in Africa, I'm working in Australia, I've seen it in lots of different nations around, and it's a big challenge here under our political system whereby people are coming up with different views on how it should be closed and what the impacts there are of. And if we're going to be planning for the future and mine owners are going to put money aside to do work or actually do work or where it all sits, we're not talking about a 5-minute political cycle here. And the stress of the investors, the mine owners, and then the ultimate return at the back end, I think that sovereign risk issue is certainly one that I would rate Australia's movement in that space as something a lot harder than I dealt with in Africa. I'd say that we do jump around a lot more than African places I've worked in, and I think that's a huge challenge for the industry.
All right, I might wrap up there just because we're over time. We do have some comments that people can read in the chat from Joe Kakuza and John Smoot, who's speaking from, I think, a US perspective there, if anyone wants to read those particular viewpoints on Christian's question and Anna's comments. But Colin, obviously, thank you so much, Anna, Rob, Anthony, Kieren, Christian, Owen, for taking part in this particular episode. It's always, I think one of the interesting ones, and definitely one to close the 2020 year off with. Colin, as a partner of the METS Arena episodes, did you have some comments you'd like to make on behalf of Mining Plus and the series?
Yeah, thanks, Shireen. I just wanted to say, thanks everyone today, but also thanks for, I know a lot of faces here today have been to a lot of the other episodes. I think what we can't remember is it 10 or 12 episodes over the last 6 months or so, which I think was started due to the COVID situation we all dealt with, and an idea that we had and shared with yourself, and it's come to fruition. I think it's been a great series, and we look forward to hopefully it going to the future. I think it still has a place, and just wanted to personally thank yourself, Shireen, for all your efforts over the last few months, and your team, and also the Victorian Government. I think Alex, I see there's hiding somewhere in the crowd today, so thanks to them as well, and just thanks for everyone that's contributed to this series. I think it's been great, and just wanted to say thank you to everyone.
Excellent. Thank you, Colin, and obviously massive thanks to Mining Plus and the Victorian Government for allowing us to have this take place. But look, I think Anna and the team are obviously contactable via their website, as are all of our METS companies. We'll send everyone a recording of this conversation and discussion, as well as all the presentations from all of our METS speakers. But if I don't see you for the rest of the year, I do hope to see you in 2021, signing off from IMARC and the METS Arena. So thank you everyone for taking part. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.